That the White Star Line had an office here, and that there were 2 transatlantic cable laying ships that happened to be just in town, and they could be leased, kitted out, and sent out. So within about 2 days that happened. By the time they got back to the site of the Titanic was anywhere between 6 and 8 days. So you can appreciate the bodies that they found. And they found in total roughly 330. There's a disagreement on how many exactly, but that's the approximate count. Here during World War II, that the convoys would start out over to the European theater. Over 2,600 ships sailed out of here during that 4.5-year period.
Let's get a movie from this thing. Headstones. One thing though, just before we get to that tree, you just sort of slightly step in the grass. For those of you who wish to take a picture, you'll see the headstones where those folks are, and there's actually 4 rows. The bottom row is curved like the bow of a ship. The next one is smaller, next one is smaller, and then here's the deck that meets. And you'll only notice it from the distance. Okay, but just to point that out in case you wish to take a picture. Please, follow me. Ships. Now, the White Star Line was actually a British registered company. And when the ship was built, it was built with enough davits. And the davits are how you lower the lifeboats. And there were enough davits to take lifeboat seats for the total possible complement. And that possible complement was 2,200 passengers and 1,100 crew. On that voyage, it was actually approximately 1,500 passengers and 700 crew. So, enough life jackets for everyone, but under British registered shipping, you only had to carry enough lifeboat seats for 1/3 of the total complement. So they only had to carry enough lifeboats for 1,100 people. Now, because a number of these lifeboats happen to be on the first class deck, and since they didn't have to, well, they didn't bother. So that meant if anything happened in that initial cruise, 1 out of every 2 people were going to die. It's interesting because under American law, you would have had to have enough lifeboats for everyone. And that particular White Star Line, a few years earlier, had been sold to J.P. Morgan. So even though it was British registered, it was American only, but that didn't matter. So they didn't. On the particular night, they knew that there was icebergs in the water. They knew it. They'd been told by at least 3 other ships. One of those ships, the SS Californian, was approximately 20 miles away. And they sent a message to the actual Titanic, and it said something like this. Okay, ice in the water, shutting down for the night. This was 10:30. So when the actual Titanic started to sink, some of the crew on the SS California were still awake, and they could see flares going off, but they thought they were just having a party. And so most of them were asleep, nothing more happened. couldn't contact the radio operator because he'd gone to bed. The crew actually had a couple up in the crow's nest, but before leaving port, the first officer was transferred. He took a key to a closet that happened to have all the binoculars in it. No one bothered to break the lock, so the crew was out there without binoculars. It was a clear night, a calm night, and therefore you wouldn't see any waves bouncing back off of the iceberg. It wasn't a particularly large iceberg, but as you probably are all aware, 90% of the berg is underwater. You only see 10%. It had melted down, and it was more what we call a blackbird, because it would more reflect the darkness. They saw it, they hollered back, they tried to turn. When they did turn, unfortunately, it scraped probably 220 feet along on the port side. That just happened to be the side that, after 3 million rivets, the last 300,000, which were a number 2 rivet, not a number 1, that's where they were. The steel, even though good steel at the time, had been in the cold water, and this was freezing water, darn close to it. So 220 feet. Now the actual hole, we'll find out later, is probably only the size of a small refrigerator. But once the water starts coming in, now there was a number of holes down below, and they figured that if water gets into 5 of them, we can still float. But what you're never aware of is the fact that each one of these holes, okay, had that much space at the top. When the water gets in one, it's just going to keep going, and the pumps could not take it out. They really couldn't. So there was a number of little calamities. The lifeboat drill that they were supposed to have on Sunday, they canceled for church services. So that particular night, on the, let's say the port side, first officer, women, children, and men only to row. And it was so confused that the first boat that went down, 63 seats, only had 29 people. The other side, we had an officer who was just letting anybody in. And it's funny, a couple of quick little stories. One gentleman dressed himself up like a woman. Another couple, in fact one of them was multi-millionaire, named Astor. He was actually got on one of the boats and then he was asked to get off. His kid, his wife, pregnant wife stayed. Another couple, very rich, they both got off. She said, I've lived with you for 40 years and my bag was. So all kinds of little things like that happen. What we're going to do, if we could, see where the flowers are. There's a row. If you go up to the end of the actual crushed rock, I'm going to be on the other side now. I'll give you a few more stories about some of the heads. Number of months after the movie was out and people found that there was a headstone here with Jack Dawson. There were so many bouquets of flowers that over that summer you could have taken and put them on every headstone here. This was never intended to be gravel, but it got so muddy with the rain and the people that they had to do it like this. They had no choice. If you take a look at any of the headstones, you're going to see the person's name if there is one. If there isn't one, they didn't know who it was. They all died on the same day, and the order in which they were taken out of the water is the number that's below it. Now, just a couple of notes. The very first headstone that you see over there, you can check when you're going to go back the same way, is Luigi Gatti. Mr. Gatti was a restaurateur in London, and he was bid on and was awarded the contract to supply the first-class restaurants. So upon receiving the contract, he went back to the old country of Italy. He got some of his friends and neighbors to come and work with him. While he was there, his young son gave him a small teddy bear. Mr. Gatti was pulled out of the water. Okay, he was one of those that died. As they're taking his clothes off, inside his jacket was that small teddy bear his son gave him right next to his heart. You may have also heard that third class or steerage were locked in for much of the time. There's a half-truth to that. Those doors were locked for at least half of the day. But they were allowed on more than one occasion to come up to the decks to get fresh air and walk around. I say that because on that particular evening, as the ship was sinking, there's a gentleman here, you can see it as we go by, it's Mr. Elliott. He was a porter, and he went down 3 times into the 3rd class to bring people up. The 3rd time he perished as the ship sank. Now, all of these particular headstones are supposed to be the same size. When the original people were buried here, they were all wooden crosses with their name, if they knew it, or a number. Then the White Star Line, the citizens and others got together and created a fund, and this is what they came up with. However, you're going to see different sizes. They were paid for by individuals, by families, or by companies. The first one is this one here, Mr. Freeman. Mr. Freeman was the valet to the president of the line. Even though JP owned it, this particular gentleman, okay, Mr. Freeman, worked for Bruce Ishmay, and Bruce was the president of the line. Now I'd like to go up to the top, and as many of you as possible go to that side, because there's a couple of obelisks up there, and I'd like to tell you a few stories. On my right, this tall headstone, Mr. Harrison, he was actually an executive with the White Star Line. And as such, his family really wanted him to be sent home. But the White Star Line, in their ignorance, and I'm not a fan of the White Star Line, you're going to find out. But they said, no, we sort of need a representative here. Well, so they built this. When this young child, probably about 2 years old, was pulled out of the water, he was the 4th individual that they had found. And the crewmen who took him out, these were tough guys. I mean, they were sailing the transatlantic in all kinds of weather. Half of that crew broke into tears when they saw this body. But they made a pact amongst them that if nobody looked after or claimed this child, they will look after him. No one claimed the child. Now, everybody in here has had a burial service. The church I showed you, the Basilica, the Jewish synagogue down the road, they all had services. The service for this young child was so overflowing that you could have used 3 more churches. And the crew itself felt that this child should be honored just as much as this executive, and so they built this and paid for it themselves.
Nice.
Now, back in the late 90s, people came and they wanted to do DNA testing, okay, on a number of individuals, especially those that they didn't know. Most of the graves, the bones, the wood, it all is gone. There's an underground water table here. And so as things disintegrate, they erode, they're just going to get washed away. However, because the crew, when they put this coffin in here, put a metal plaque on top of it, that plaque fell on the child's chest when the wood rotted away, and they were able to get DNA.
Wow.
So, but their findings told them that basically, until then, behind this particular lady here, you're going to see Paulson. Elma Paulson and her 4 children were coming over from Sweden. They had tickets on a tramp steamer that took them as far as Southampton. In Southampton there was a coal strike, so only certain ships were getting the coal. theirs wasn't one of it. She did manage to secure passage, okay, in a steerage passenger. When the actual ship was sinking, she knew about it, but she took so long to dress her children from the cold that when she got up, the last lifeboat was going. The gentleman she'd met to give me the baby, he got on a boat, but we understand with all the jostling and everything else that he may have dropped the child, and so none of them survived. But they thought for many years that's who it was. The DNA, well, what it did, it proved the child was from Northern Europe. Further refinements in Britain, and today they did discover, okay, about 10 years ago, this young child was Sydney Leslie Goodman. Now, the flowers, the coins, the pennies, the rocks. In Europe, as in other places, but mainly in Europe, both the Celtic tribes and those of the Jewish faith, when they were near something that there was a tragedy or a heinous murder, okay, and they found out, what they would often do is take a rock and put it there. My thoughts are with you. I'm leaving, but God bless, etc., etc. Over the years, these rocks would grow, and if you go in certain parts, especially in Britain, you'll find they actually made them into cairns, okay? The rocks and stones and everything in this pile. Some of them even have plaques on them now. But this is what it was about. So people here, when they come, many times they will just leave something. 3 more items. 1, for many years, okay, and I think it's the grounds crew, there was a little stuffed animal here, and every night it would be here, and every morning it would be in front of that. And this went on the whole summer. And I say it because I happen to do chores at different times. You know, it's almost as if, well, the child, you put it here because this is a headstone, but it made its way back over. Now, there's no truth to it. I swear it's the ground thing, it just fits. 2 quick notes on the White Star Line and why I'm a little biased about them. It isn't necessarily proven, but it was said by a couple of crew members that the White Star Line contracted them to go from Southampton to New York and back to Southampton. Since the ship went down halfway over, these crew members that actually survived only got paid 1/4 of their wages because they never completed the job. Number 2, the band was hired. One of the members, John Jacob Astor, was down here 5 or 6 headstones. But they were hired, they were supplied with uniforms. And as such, the supply of uniforms, they were supposed to pay them back. Now, these band members died. Okay? But 6 weeks after that, Mr. Hume-Law's family got a bill for the cost of his funeral. Yeah, he was never paid, of course, but still. So they're just some little things, but I mean they were a bad liner. I just happened to just like them a bit.